The question then tonight is Jesus the Jew, but what sort of Jew? In 1848, Richard Wagner composed his prose sketch for a proposed opera called The Death of Siegfried. Well, little did Wagner realize at the time that his initial plan would ultimately result in 4 huge operas comprising a tetralogy, The Ring of the Nibelungen. Now, if I may compare great things with small, in 1988, when David Noel Friedman and I sipped Sonoma Chardonnay on a balcony overlooking the cove at La Jolla, hard by this very university, and agreed upon a book on the historical Jesus, little did either of us realize that we were talking about a tetralogy as well. I would have thrown myself over the balcony if I had known. Oh, for the blessed ignorance God gives us. So much did we take for granted that my work would comprise only 1 volume that the contract with Doubleday never stipulated that point. Jawohl. No doubt Doubleday has since fired all the lawyers who drew up that contract and has made the precise number of volumes an indispensable clause for any future agreement. But willy-nilly, I am left with 4 books on Jesus of Nazareth. No doubt the 4 evangelists and Carl Jung would be pleased. I am rather pleased by the fact that Volume 3 of A Marginal Jew, Companions and Competitors has just been published last month. All 3 volumes that have appeared, and the 4th and final volume now in preparation, struggle to put together a coherent answer to the question posed by tonight's lecture. Jesus the Jew. Yes, yes, by now Jesus the Jew is an academic cliche. Thank you, Voltaire. Jesus the Jew, but what sort of Jew was he? As an initial stab at answering this question, permit me first to summarize ever so quickly the first 3 volumes of A Marginal Jew, plus a sketch of Volume 4, to show you what I have come up with so far. At the end of this mad dash through the Uffizi, I will try to formulate, first, if you've ever done it through the Uffizi, you know what I mean. After the mad dash, I will try to formulate first in a negative, then in a positive way. Structuralists would love the bipolar approach. First in a negative, then in a positive way, a brief global answer to the question this lecture poses. The patient readers of the first 2 volumes of A Marginal Jew embarked on a carefully mapped out journey from preliminary and general questions about the historical Jesus to more particular and concrete conclusions about this enigmatic Jew. With unperturbed pace, the readers moved from an initial survey of methods and sources through the beginnings of Jesus' life and ministry to major sayings and actions of his public career. After Volume 1 sketched in the background, chronology, and early years of Jesus, Volume 2 focused on key sayings and deeds of Jesus, his proclamation of the kingdom of God, both future and present, and the startling deeds he performed, which he and his disciples considered miracles. This focus on Jesus' message and miracles was an intense but narrow one. With the one exception of Jesus' mentor, John the Baptist, Volume 2 aimed the spotlight squarely at Jesus himself, Jesus alone, das Ding an sich. This preliminary narrow focus in Volume 2 was a necessary step, since the very meaning of the central symbol kingdom of God is disputed, and since Jesus' supposed miracles are certainly the most controversial of his deeds. But by the end of Volume 2, it was high time to widen the circle of light around Jesus. As phenomenology stresses, no human being is adequately understood if he or she is considered in isolation from other human beings. A human being becomes fully human only by entering into dynamic relationships of friendship and love, enmity and hate, control, subordination, and collaboration with other humans. Now, if this be true of human beings in general, it is all the more true of a charismatic religious leader whose very status and impact are determined by his social relationships. It is especially true of a particular first-century Jew named Jesus of Nazareth, whose adult life is largely defined in terms of his relationships to other Jewish individuals and groups in Palestine. The adult Jesus first comes into view as, notice, he joins a particular eschatological group. He doesn't go off on his own. His life begins as an adult by joining a particular eschatological group marked by baptism and repentance, a group led by a strange individual called John the Baptist, or more literally, John the Plunger, or John the Dunker. That's what Baptistes means. And indeed, it was most unusual. Of course, Jews used all sorts of water illustrations, mikvah and all that, but you did that to yourself. The idea that some individual starts dunking everybody else, it was so strange, it gave him his second name, which is not a Christian invention, it's in Josephus. Baptistes, John the Plunger. And Jesus got dunked like everybody else. Then, drawing some disciples from this strange group, Jesus soon struck out on his own with a new message of God's imminent, yet present kingdom, a message addressed not to some, but to all Israel. Moving from town to town in itinerant ministry, Jesus attracted an inner and outer circle of followers from among his fellow Jews. He convinced at least some people that he had healed their illnesses or expelled their demons. He engaged in religious disputes with other devout Jews, and he presumed to teach his co-religionists how to observe the Mosaic law properly. Within his own circle, he taught his disciples special prayer forms, observances, and beliefs that mark them off as an identifiable group within, not outside of, first-century Palestinian Judaism. His ministry was also striking in that it attracted, on the one hand, an unusual following from among women of both high and low social status, and on the other, convivial fellowship with such social and religious lowlife as tax collectors and sinners. We know about those types. Still, not all of Jesus' contacts were so happy. In the end, his more negative relationships proved deadly. The priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem, headed by Caiaphas, decided he was dangerous, and Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect from 28 to 38 AD, decided he was dangerous enough to crucify. Now, the point of this thumbnail sketch of Jesus' public ministry I've just given you is to underline a simple truth. To tell the story of Jesus is to tell the story of his various relationships. Without them, he's nothing. His relation to individuals like Peter or Judas, his relation to groups of followers like disciples and the 12, and to Jewish movements like the Pharisees or the Sadducees. It is this defining web of relationships that I have tried to examine in Volume 3, just published. I dare say it is a web of relationships that all too often has been neglected in recent work on the historical Jesus. Perhaps Americans love a story about a solitary hero struggling against the evil forces of society. Or perhaps the popular American religious spirit does not like a historical Jesus who creates embryonic structures like the Circle of the 12. Whatever the reason, the full range of Jesus' relationships with Jewish groups and individuals has not been a burning central concern of the Jesus research lionized in recent years by the American media. Volume 3 seeks to correct the balance. This emphasis on Jesus' relationships is inextricably woven with a second key emphasis in Volume 3, likewise neglected in some recent works on the historical Jesus. The second emphasis is the essentially Jewish nature of Jesus' relationships. Strange to say, in recent years, a number of authors engaged in the so-called third quest for the historical Jesus have been noteworthy for their lack of focus on the Jewishness of Jesus and his relationships with other Jews. Now, this is extremely odd, considering the origins of the third quest for the historical Jesus in the 1970s and 80s. When the third quest was launched, one of the main characteristics that distinguished it from the first quest for the historical Jesus in 19th century German scholarship and the second existentialist quest of the students of Rudolf Bultmann in the 1950s and 60s was its firm determination to take the Jewishness of Jesus with utter seriousness and to situate him squarely within Palestinian Judaism at the turn of the era. Both Gezer Vermesch in England and E.P. Sanders in North America trumpeted this new emphasis with the titles of their books. Indeed, Vermesch's trilogy sounds quite rightly like a Jewish anvil chorus. Jesus the Jew, Jesus and the world of Judaism, and the religion of Jesus the Jew. For his part, E.P. Sanders summarized his entire program with the succinct phrase, Jesus and Judaism, while James H. Charlesworth of Princeton offered the friendly amendment of Jesus within Judaism. Such was the promise of the third quest at its beginnings. It has continued to be honored by some scholars, such as Dale Allison, Bart Ehrman, and Paula Friedrichsen on this side of the Atlantic, and N.T. Wright and James Dunn on the other. Yet, especially among certain scholars now or formerly connected with the Jesus Seminar, emphasis on the Jewishness of Jesus is hardly a central concern. Whether one looks at the more hefty works of writers like John Dominic Crossan and Burton Mack, or the more sensationalistic and popular works of authors like Robert Funk, one finds Jesus the cynic philosopher, or Jesus the generic Mediterranean peasant, or Jesus the social revolutionary, or Jesus the religious iconoclast, largely overshadowing, if not obliterating, the specific first century Palestinian Jew named Jesus. To be sure, words like Jew and Jewish often adorn the titles or the subtitles of such works, and politically correct comments are made about the importance of Jesus' Jewishness. But in most of these books, one searches in vain for detailed treatments of the various religious movements swirling around Jesus, those various religious movements competing for influence in first century Palestine. Consequently, one looks in vain for treatments of the ways in which Jesus the Jew interacted with or reacted to these groups as he debated questions of Jewish practice and belief. One sees then why the double concern of Volume 3 of A Marginal Jew, the varied relationships that define Jesus, and the essentially Jewish nature of these relationships needs a thorough airing. In fact, one of the main goals of the first two volumes of A Marginal Jew was precisely to lay the groundwork for this pivotal examination of Jesus the Jew and his Jewish relationships in Volume 3. For instance, Part 2 of Volume 1, The Roots of the Person, offered a preliminary and inevitably rough sketch of Jesus' immediate familial relations, as well as the linguistic, cultural, and political context in which he grew up in Lower Galilee in the early years of the first century CE. And not surprisingly, I do not find too many Greco-Roman cynic philosophers bouncing around the villages of southern Galilee. In fact, the dirty little secret is cynic philosophy was an eclipse and practically disappeared from the cities of the Roman Empire from the latter part of the first century BCE to the latter part of the first century CE. How Jesus was one when there practically were no ones anywhere else is a mystery I haven't quite plummeted yet. Volume 2 brought the question of relationships into the public ministry by focusing on, first, Jesus' relationship to his mentor, John the Baptist, a pivotal relationship often glossed over. Second, his relationship to all Israel, as he presented himself as the eschatological prophet, proclaiming the imminent yet present kingdom of God. And third, his relationship to a great Jewish symbol, the miracle-working northern Israelite itinerant prophet Elijah, on which he seemed quite consciously to pattern a good part of his ministry. Still, as I've said, despite these initial intimations of relationships that help define Jesus, most of the first two volumes remain focused on Jesus himself. Only with volume 3 do I begin to widen the spotlight to include the Jewish individuals and groups that were interacting with Jesus as he traveled about Galilee and Judea, proclaiming his message of the kingdom and engaging in faith healing. To provide order, hopefully not an entirely arbitrary order, to the complicated tangle of Jesus' relationships, I chose to divide Volume 3 into two parts. Part 1, Jesus' relationships with his Jewish followers of various types, and Part 2, Jesus' relationships with the competing Jewish groups or movements in the Palestine of his day. Part 1 treats Jesus' relationships, conflictual as well as amicable, with his various types of, quotes, followers, and follower itself is a problematic category. Part 1 arranges the swirling and no doubt overlapping clusters of followers into 3 concentric circles, a mandala if you like. First, the outer circle of the crowds that follow Jesus in a purely physical sense, chapter 24. Second, the middle circle of the disciples whom Jesus called to follow him in both a physical and a spiritual sense, chapter 25. And then the inner circle of the 12, the third inner group, specifically chosen by Jesus to symbolize his mission to the 12 tribes of Israel and to share in his mission to all Israel. There was a reason they were precisely 12 in number. Fortunately for us, a few members of the 12, notably James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and Simon Peter, had memorable, if not always happy, personal encounters with their leader. Hence, we can give greater precision and depth to the portrait of Jesus by focusing on his relationships with these key individuals in his entourage in chapter 27. Now, despite bizarre speculation in recent literature about other disciples, like the ever-popular Thomas, Jude, or Judas, we know little or nothing about the other members of the 12. Through all this, it is important to remember that this neat pattern of 3 concentric circles is a useful academic model, not without a basis in reality, but hardly reflecting what was surely a more fluid and complicated situation. As I note when I treat the second circle, that of the disciples, certain groups simply do not fit comfortably into this neat 3-part construct. For example, the stay-at-home supporters who didn't give up family and employment to follow Jesus. Who was going to offer hospitality and food and home when Jesus and the whole gang hit town? Somebody had to stay at home to do that. Secondly, of course, the other group that doesn't fit neatly, the female followers, who must have raised a few pious eyebrows by running around with Jesus and the male companions on his preaching tours, apparently without benefit of husbands or chaperones. Neither group, by the way, is ever explicitly called disciples in the earliest sources, an interesting question I have to delve into in Volume 3. So much then for Part 1 of Volume 3. Part 2 of Volume 3 goes on to explore the other side of Jesus' relationships. Obviously, no great historical figure, especially the leader of a group or a movement within a larger society, can be adequately understood simply by examining those who followed or agreed with him or her. This isn't the narcissism of academia. Competitors or opponents are just as, if not more important, for a full portrait. I always tell my students, don't worry about your friends, but choose your enemies carefully, because your enemies always form you much more than your friends do. Hence, Part 2 considers major Jewish groups or movements that competed for influence or power, political, religious, or both, among Palestinian Jews in the 1st century CE. Religious as well as political influence was a highly contested commodity in first century Jewish Palestine. The very fact that Jesus sought to persuade his fellow Jews to accept his message and follow his lead inevitably put him into competition with other religious and/or political groups. This holds true whether Jesus personally engaged in controversies with members of these groups, as seems to be the case with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or whether he competed for adherents from a physical as well as a psychological distance, as was probably the case with the members of the Qumran community. No doubt, most prominent among Jesus' competitors were the Pharisees, if for no other reason, that they, like Jesus, were active among the common people and frequently won their respect, if not their wholehearted compliance. Because of their special position among the common people, the Pharisees were to prove vital for the survival and future shape of Judaism. The great problem here, though, is that the exact origins, nature, beliefs, and practices of the Pharisees are a hotly contested area among scholars today, Jew and Gentile alike. The fact that first-class scholars like Jacob Neusner, E.P. Sanders, Anthony Saldarini, and Roland Dines have all disagreed on various aspects of the Pharisees should sound an alarm bell for any academic addicted to sweeping and simplistic claims. The dirty little secret of New Testament exegesis is that no one is completely sure who the Pharisees were. That doesn't stop me from writing a whole big chapter about them, of course. Someone has to clean up the Augean stables. Hence, to treat the problem of the historical Jesus in his relationship to the historical Pharisees demands a lengthy disquisition into the practices and beliefs of the Pharisees. This quest for the historical Pharisee, which I think is more difficult than the quest for the historical Jesus, takes up a good deal of chapter 28 in volume 3. Chapter 28 also faces the further complication that the Pharisees may have been inserted secondarily into dispute stories in which the original antagonists of Jesus were anonymous. But at least there is a fair amount of gospel material about the Pharisees. Much sparser is the presence of the Sadducees in the Gospels. Now, this only stands to reason, since the rich aristocratic Sadducees, to a great degree of priestly stock and concentrated in Jerusalem, were not actively competing for esteem and influence among the common people in the exact same way the Pharisees were. Hence, they would not have interacted with Jesus as frequently as the Pharisees did. More problematic still is the fact that, having left no self-description or literature of their own, the Sadducees have been fated to be described only by their opponents. We all know that the Sadducees were the bad guys because all their enemies tell us so. When you stop to think of it, have you ever heard a Sadducee describe himself? It's the New Testament, it's the later rabbinic literature, it's Josephus, all of whom couldn't stand the Sadducees for various reasons, who tell us who the Sadducees were. Can you imagine if only your worst enemies were allowed to leave a description of you for future generations? So we all know the Sadducees were the bad guys, right? Well, they didn't have an easy job of it either, trying to keep the lid on. Still, despite the Sadducees' shadowy nature and their rare appearances in the New Testament, something I think can be said about their interaction with Jesus, thanks to the curious dispute over the general resurrection of the dead that we have preserved in Mark 12, which I treat in chapter 29. Well, once we get past the Pharisees and the Sadducees, things become more confusing still. You thought the Pharisees and Sadducees were bad. It becomes worse because we are left with a number of marginal groups of Israelites, which I survey in chapter 30. In some cases, any direct interaction between these groups and Jesus is either highly questionable or quite limited. Here in chapter 30, as a sort of mop-up operation, I include the hotly debated question of the Essenes in general and the Qumranites in particular. Not surprisingly, they take up most of the chapter. In more summary fashion, I review a potpourri of groups whose relationship to the historical Jesus turns out to be slight or non-existent: Samaritans, scribes, Herodians, and zealots. With these scattered groups, I complete my survey of the various clusters of Jews who either did interact or may have interacted with Jesus during his public ministry. It is sobering to realize that we are often left with generalizations about generic groups. Personal, ongoing relationships with named individuals like Simon Peter, James, and John, or Mary Magdalene are few and far between, and notice are found almost entirely on the side of followers rather than competitors or opponents. Not until we reach the end of Jesus' career are we able to name individual opponents who both interact directly with Jesus and are known from sources outside the New Testament, namely Annas, Caiaphas, and Pilate. As we go through this survey of various Jewish groups at the time of Jesus, we should remember that probably the vast majority of ordinary Jews in Palestine belong to none of the groups I've just described. The majority of Palestinian Jews were happy to practice the basics of their religion, notably circumcision, Sabbath observance, food laws, and pilgrimage to the Jerusalem temple when possible for the great feast. By the way, we should remember, and I'll come back to this later on, we should remember that these feasts were celebrated according to the commonly accepted religious calendar inculcated by the priestly aristocracy, and that the ritual was carried out by the priest in power. Whatever their personal feelings towards an Annas or a Caiaphas, and in the ancient world, unlike, say, present-day Catholic Church, cult of personality of the great leader was not all that big. Whatever their personal feelings toward an Annas or a Caiaphas, the vast majority of Palestinian Jews looked to the high priest presiding in Jerusalem as the divinely constituted leader and representative of their nation. Just as they looked to the temple, he controlled as the concrete center of their religion. Shia Cohen, a great scholar of the turn of the era period in rabbinics, once said to me, and I was shocked, he said, "You must remember, before the destruction of the temple, it was probably the Jerusalem temple, even more than the Mosaic law, that was the central magnet symbol for all Jews." That sort of rocked my brains. I'm sure other people would dispute that. But I think we tend to underestimate how important that Jerusalem temple was as the cosmic navel, the center for all Jews, no matter what else they might fight about, with some exceptions we shall see. As for esoteric disputes over the fine details of legal observance, most ordinary Jews had neither the leisure nor the learning, nor perhaps the interest, that fired the zeal of competing religious groups. Together with such non-sectarian groups as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these ordinary observant Jews made up what various scholars today call mainstream or common Judaism in first century Palestine. Now, the concept of a mainstream Judaism should not be confused with the old-time erroneous error that there was some sort of monolithic normative or orthodox Judaism at the time, even in the more nuanced sense that scholars like Roland Dines have tried to champion recently. Judaism, even within Palestine, was remarkably varied in belief and practice. Indeed, placing both the Pharisees and the Sadducees in this mainstream Judaism is meant to underline that point. Both groups, as well as the mass of ordinary Jews, belong to a broad, if not easily defined, mainstream that held to the basic practices and beliefs of the Jewish religion. Monotheism, God's choice of Israel as a special people, God's gift of the Mosaic law, circumcision, Sabbath, food laws. Mainstream Judaism looked to that Jerusalem temple as its cultic center and the priestly aristocracy as its religious leaders. And despite all the internal disputes, mainstream Judaism did not formally break away from that center and that leadership in favor of some sectarian movement, as did precisely Qumran. There is a distance. We go out to the desert, we form our own spiritual temple or monastery, and we will not go to the temple in Jerusalem and submit to those priests. There is the break from mainstream Judaism. The Pharisees and Sadducees never did that. It was this mainstream Judaism of Palestine that Jesus the Jew addressed, wooed, and warned. Indeed, it was from this mainstream Judaism that Jesus emerged, and it was in relationship to this Judaism that Jesus defined his special role. Now, this last observation raises a vital question in regard to the very title I've chosen for my series. If indeed Jesus arose from and defined himself vis-a-vis mainstream Judaism in Palestine, in what sense then should or could he be considered a, quotes, marginal Jew? Doesn't that mean he's not in the mainstream? Regrettably, and contrary to my express statements as laid out in Volume 1, some critics have taken the phrase a marginal Jew to be my set definition of Jesus rather than my refusal to give a set definition. Like God in the burning bush to Moses, Ayeh Asher Ayeh, I will be what I shall be, is perhaps a refusal to give a name by which you can control him. So too a marginal Jew. As I stressed when I introduced the phrase in Volume 1, a marginal Jew is meant to imitate the riddle speech of Jesus himself. Think of his use of Son of Man. Far from presenting a Cartesian, clear and distinct idea of Jesus, a marginal Jew is intended to open up a set of questions. Indeed, sociologists themselves use the adjective marginal in a number of different ways to designate different phenomena. The first and most important meaning I give the term, as applied to Jesus, underlines the simple fact that as far as Jewish and pagan literature in the century after Jesus' death was concerned, Jesus was at most a blip on the radar screen. Blink and you miss him in Josephus and Tacitus. The person who was to become the key religious figure of Western civilization started out so far on the periphery as to be barely visible. That paradox, if nothing else, is what the label marginal is meant to drive home for the reader, especially for the traditional Christian reader, who is used to believing that Jesus is the center and goal of history. He was a blip on the radar screen. Other meanings of a marginal Jew are also possible and need to be probed further. In some of his teachings and practices, from rejection of voluntary fasting and the prohibition of divorce to symbolic warnings of the temple's destruction, Jesus seemed intent on marginalizing himself, at least from the center of power in Jerusalem and perhaps from certain other pious Jews besides. In the end, Caiaphas and Pilate marginalized him with the shameful death of the crucifixion. As Flannery O'Connor once observed, you can't be poorer than dead. What must be stressed in these and other possible meanings of marginal is that in no way is the term intended to deny, attenuate, or to call into question the essential Jewishness of Jesus. To take a rough analogy from the history of the time, in one sense, the people at Qumran had been pushed to the margins socially and politically by the rulers in Jerusalem. In another sense, the Qumranites had willfully marginalized themselves vis-a-vis what they saw as an apostate Israel. Yet no one would question the intense and profound Jewish nature of the Qumran community. Well, having so briefly sketched the first 3 volumes, I should say a few words about my plans for the 4th, and I am determined the final volume of A Marginal Jew. I, unlike the evangelists, would like to see my work finished. Not unlike the negotiations of the Israeli-Palestinian peace plan at Camp David, I have purposely left the hardest problems to last, hopefully not with the same results. The final volume will deal with the last 4 enigmas that Jesus posed and was. I intentionally put these 4 great puzzles together precisely because their enigmatic quality has at times been, I think, underplayed or overlooked. Let me briefly explain this point enigma by enigma. Enigma number 1. The treatment of Jesus' relationship to the Mosaic law commonly swings between two extremes. In olden times, before the flood, namely when American exegesis was largely dominated by German scholarship, it was often taken for granted that Jesus, of course, opposed or abolished the law, at least in principle, or implicitly by his actions, if not explicitly by his teaching. Of course, yes. Today, the pendulum has largely swung in the opposite direction. The Jewishness of Jesus is often facilely taken to mean that his relationship to the Mosaic law is straightforward, unproblematic. That's it. Jesus was a devout Jew who affirmed and observed the Mosaic law. That is the end of the matter. Now, while the first part of that affirmation is certainly correct, the understanding of the Mosaic law and the various stances vis-a-vis the law in first century Palestine were not quite so simple. When we descend from generalities to particulars, Jesus' stance vis-a-vis the law poses a notable enigma, especially when we get to concrete areas like divorce and oath-taking. Enigma number 2, the parables of Jesus. Now, to many readers who are well acquainted with books about the historical Jesus, my decision to reserve a treatment of Jesus' parables to the final volume must seem very enigmatic in itself. Surely, from Adolf Jülicher through C.H. Dodd and Joachim Jeremias to Norman Perrin, John Dominic Crossan, the Jesus Seminar and beyond, the parables have been for scholars of every stripe the royal road, the easiest path, the surest access route to the historical Jesus. I beg to differ. Faced with the same strict application of the criteria of historicity used for any other gospel material, many of the parables of Jesus may not fare as well as some scholars would like to believe. Neither the sentiment of Christian Sunday school nor the worst sentimentality of academics can give the parables a free pass. Enigma number 3. Instead of talking about the titles of Jesus, or worse still, the Christological titles of Jesus, I think it best to understand the ways in which the historical Jesus may have referred to himself, for example, Son of Man, as enigmatic riddle speech, not unlike the parables. Like the parables, the strange phrases he used to refer to himself were meant to tease the mind into active thought, to pose uncomfortable questions to his audience instead of supplying pat answers, which, by the way, was the original intent of using a marginal Jew. And finally, enigma number 4. The precise reason or reasons why the life of this miracle-working Elijah-like prophet from Galilee ended as it did, namely by crucifixion in Jerusalem at the hands of the Roman prefect on the charge of claiming to be king of the Jews, is the starkest, most disturbing, and most central of all the enigmas Jesus posed and was. In some ways, as with the Gospels as they're written, so with A Quest for the Historical Jesus, one senses rather disjuncture rather than connection between what is said of public ministry and what is said of passion, trial, and death. Indeed, any reconstruction of the historical Jesus must end with this enigma and ultimately must be judged adequate or inadequate by its ability to shed light on this final enigma. These, then, are the 4 final enigmas that Volume 4 will seek to solve, what I might call, with a bow to Sir Edward Elgar, my enigma variations. But what does all this have to contribute to the central question of this lecture this evening, namely, what sort of Jew was Jesus? What is the upshot, the payoff of my first 3 volumes and the proposed 4th when it comes to sketching a global portrait of this kind of Jew Jesus was? After we finished roller skating through the Uffizi, what do we come up with? Permit me to try to answer this question first in a negative and then in a positive way. First, the via negativa. The question of what sort of Jew Jesus was is hardly new. In fact, it is entertaining, almost hilarious, to survey the literature to see how Jesus has at one time or another been identified with each of the four major groups of Jews described by the Jewish historian Josephus. First, and understandably, Jesus has often been identified as a Pharisee, since the Pharisaic movement was the group active and popular among the common Jewish people of Palestine. Not surprisingly then, the Pharisees are the group that Jesus interacts with most in the Gospels. Jesus and the Pharisees shared a consuming desire to call all Israel, and not just an esoteric special group like Qumran, to call all Israel to the complete doing of God's will as revealed in Torah and prophets. Both Jesus and the Pharisees shared a belief in God's guidance of his people through history to a final consummation involving the restoration of Israel, a final judgment, and the resurrection of the dead. So Jesus is a Pharisee. Some scholars see in the supposedly liberal Jesus a humanitarian religious leader like Hillel. Hillel was a Pharisee famed for his emphasis on humane interpretation of the law, guided by the central principle of love of neighbor. Others instead point to Jesus' rejection of divorce, which would seem to align him more with the stringent Pharisee Shammai. Well, actually, for all the similarities, some deep differences divided Jesus from the Pharisees. First of all, granted the peculiar mix of present yet future eschatology in Jesus' preaching and actions, Jesus implicitly made himself a key figure in the eschatological drama he proclaimed, something that is not true of Hillel, Shammai, or any other Pharisee of which we know. Second, the historical Jesus performed startling deeds that at least he and his followers believed to be miracles, miracles that he interpreted as signs and even foretaste of the end time. Now, while there are scattered stories about Pharisees prophesying or performing other astounding feats, no individual Pharisee before 70 CE was identified in his own time as a miracle worker who performed a whole series of miracles. Third, more importantly, the Pharisees were known for their special legal practices, the traditions of the elders or the traditions of the fathers, which, though not present in the written Torah of Moses, were considered normative. In particular, the Pharisees were punctilious in their observance of legal observances concerning tithing, purity laws, Sabbath, marriage and divorce, and temple ritual. It is on such points that Jesus diverges notably from the Pharisees. First, the schools of Hillel and Shammai may have argued about the precise grounds for divorce, but they, like all Jews, accepted the institution of divorce and certain grounds for it. It was mentioned in the Torah, it was sanctioned by the Torah. Jesus totally rejected divorce, thus abrogating an important social institution permitted and regulated by the Torah. Second, the Pharisees esteemed and practiced voluntary fasting, while Jesus forbade his disciples to fast. Third, so famous or notorious did Jesus become for his eating with tax collectors and sinners that he was mocked by his opponents as a glutton and a wine-bibber, a friend of toll collectors and sinners. Unlike his ascetic mentor, John the Baptist, Jesus loved a good party, or as I always tell the students in Notre Dame, he was a party animal. He would have done well in Southern California. Fourth, nevertheless, and quite oddly, Jesus the bon vivant seems to have been a celibate and to have interpreted his celibacy in light of the coming kingdom of God that he proclaimed, a strange combination, being a celibate and being a bon vivant, or at least in there bishops and priests can claim some apostolic succession. And fifth, more globally, delete that from the TV tape. Fifth, more globally, Jesus seemed not to share the Pharisees' concern for detailed study and observance of the fine points of the law. All these traits, especially when taken together as various expressions of Jesus' eschatological mission and lifestyle, do mark him off from the Pharisees. Well, granted Jesus' opposition to various Pharisaic teachings and practices, some scholars have swung in the opposite direction by suggesting, I think strangely, that Jesus belonged to or was at least sympathetic with the Sadducees, After all, they say, the Sadducees, like Jesus, rejected the traditions of the elders held dear by the Pharisees. Sadducees and Jesus agreed in that anyway. Yet Jesus had even less in common with the Sadducees, the group favored by the wealthy and politically powerful aristocracy. The Sadducees were small in number, concentrated in and around Jerusalem, and were made up largely of the priestly and lay nobility. It is not surprising that the only detailed encounter between Jesus and the Sadducees, the debate over the resurrection of the dead, was unrelievedly hostile. Jesus ends the entire dispute with a statement unparalleled elsewhere, "You gravely err." He did not like the Sadducees. He would debate with the Pharisees. He apparently did not like the Sadducees. Well, they reciprocated. Annas and Caiaphas, the two priestly leaders involved in Jesus' arrest, were most likely Sadducees, and both Luke and Josephus indicate that after Jesus' crucifixion, persecution of Christian Jews in Jerusalem stemmed largely from the Sadducees, not the Pharisees. Well, what then about the ever-popular tendency in some quarters to make Jesus an Essene, or more precisely, a member of the community of Qumran by the Dead Sea? To be sure, Jesus and Qumran both represent an eschatological mindset within Palestinian Judaism around the turn of the era. Both display a certain mix of already and not yet expectations, with hints of some messianic figure or figures playing a role in the final drama. Interestingly, in matters of sex, Qumran and Jesus both tend toward stringent standards and prohibitions, a trait not usually emphasized by modern American questers. At least some members of Qumran may have practiced celibacy, and both the Damascus document and the Temple Scroll display notable restrictions on, if not absolute prohibition of, divorce. To some degree, therefore, Jesus and Qumran do reflect a common pattern, a fiercely eschatological viewpoint resulting in a fiercely radical ethic. And yet, there are many deep differences between Jesus and Qumran. One prime example is the Jerusalem temple. That's why I stressed it so much before. The Qumranites had withdrawn physically from the Jerusalem temple, which they considered defiled by an illegitimate priesthood, celebrating incorrect rituals according to an inaccurate liturgical calendar. Oy vey, you weren't celebrating the great feast on the proper day. Calendar was everything. While Jesus probably predicted and even symbolically acted out a coming destruction of the temple, what we call the cleansing of the temple, in the meantime, Jesus regularly went up to the temple during the great feast and used the large crowds assembled in the temple courts as a ready-made audience for proclaiming his message to all Israel. As far as we can tell, particularly from John's Gospel, during the great feast, Jesus was present and active in the temple at the very same time everyone else was. Hence, he seems to have followed the type of lunar calendar observed in the temple by the priestly aristocracy and not the solar calendar observed at Qumran. Indeed, in John's Gospel, chapter 10, Jesus is even in the temple to observe the relatively new, minor, and very Hasmonean feast of Hanukkah. The only time Hanukkah is mentioned in the New Testament is when Jesus is observing it in chapter 10 of John's Gospel. Noticeably, it's mentioned, but he's talking within the portico of Solomon, the only time that's sort of mentioned, because it's Hanukkah, December winter season, the rains are there. So he at least knows enough to get out of the rain, even though he's an eschatological prophet. He's walking in the portico of Solomon instead. The great mistake of Jesus' seminar, and so much Jesus, they throw out John's Gospel a priori. He knows what Hanukkah is, he knows when it's celebrated, he knows what the weather is like in Jerusalem, and which portico Jesus would be under, and you throw out John's Gospel. He knows more about the typography of Jerusalem, the temple, and the feast than the three synoptic Gospels put together. The folly of the Jesus seminar in that one act speaks volumes. So this regular attendance of the Jewish feast on the dates of the commonly accepted calendar is a weighty indication that Jesus arose from and operated within mainstream Judaism, as opposed to some sectarian or esoteric movement such as Qumran. As for the details of legal observance, the Qumranites made even the Pharisees look lax by comparison. Whether one considers the rule of the community, the Damascus document, or the so-called halakhic letter, the Qumranites evince an intense, some would say obsessive concern with purity rules and other detailed laws reaching into every corner of daily life. Jesus, in contrast, is concerned that detailed purity rules not overshadow what he considered the truly weighty elements of the law, summed up as love of God and love of neighbor. While he observed the Sabbath, going regularly to the synagogue, perhaps a relatively recent institution in Palestinian Judaism, Jesus takes what we moderns might call a liberal and humanitarian view of Sabbath observance. He certainly keeps Sabbath. The idea of Jesus abolishing the Sabbath is nonsense. It's a question of how you keep it. What is perhaps more telling, though, is the glaring absence from the Gospels of the vast majority of legal concerns treated at length in the Qumran documents. Far from being concerned about the minutiae of purity rules, Jesus was known for his frequent dining with the social and religious lowlife of Palestine, the very people who embodied the antithesis of the scrupulous purity observed by the Qumranites at their communal meals. When it came to interpreting the scriptures, Jesus, the woodworker from Nazareth, who may or may not have been literate, displays none of the careful, punctilious, scribal picking over of text, and none of the clever searching out for proof text seen in the documents of Qumran. Indeed, Jesus' pronouncements on the Mosaic Law have a certain ad hoc quality to them. They are grounded ultimately in his implicit claim to authority as a charismatic prophet, an authority summed up in his famous introductory and peremptory formula, "Amen, I say to you. It's so because I say it so." No doubt you have professors who say the same thing. Jesus said it on somewhat higher grounds. One can see why, then, the documents of Qumran never mention Jesus, and Jesus never mentions Qumran or the Essenes. Jesus and the Pharisees at least inhabited the same religious universe. Jesus and Qumran did not. One is reminded of Otto von Bismarck's doubts about the likelihood of war between a great land power like Germany and a great naval power like Britain. Von Bismarck said, "A land rat and a water rat, where would they fight?" So that's why there is nothing about Jesus and Qumran in the New Testament. Well, as long as we're talking about fighting, why don't we throw in the good old zealots? To be sure, the zealots remain popular in Hollywood movies, TV series, and historical fiction in Southern California in general, but most serious scholars have long since given up on them as the group to which Jesus belonged. When Josephus uses the term "the zealots," he almost always means an organized and armed group of revolutionaries rebelling against Roman rule in Palestine. The zealots, in this sense, did not emerge as a distinct armed group until the first Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 CE, close to about 40 years after Jesus had been crucified. It is therefore hopelessly anachronistic to talk about Jesus being a zealot or even being sympathetic to the zealots, understood in this technical sense of the word. Indeed, during Jesus' public ministry of about 28 to 30 CE, there is no hard proof, despite endless TV movies on the subject, there is no hard proof of any organized, armed rebellion against Roman rule in Judea. And of course, the Romans didn't rule directly in Galilee. Herod Antipas, a Jewish prince, did. Herod the Fox, who very cleverly observed Judaism in public so as not to offend his Jewish populace. To be sure, there were various bandits upsetting public order. There were prophetic movements stirring up the people, various protests of Rome's heavy-handed and insensitive governance in Judea, and a great deal of deep-seated resentment, to be sure. Nevertheless, while Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea for the extraordinary long tenure of 10 years, he was either the longest or second longest reigning governor in Judea during that whole period, despite his 10-year-long reign, one can count on one hand the number of significant protests and demonstrations of passive resistance by large crowds of Jews, and not one single case of organized armed rebellion. Pilate, the Roman prefect, and Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, working probably for the most part in hand and glove, knew how to keep the show on the road and the lid on the province. To be sure, numerous Jews were zealous for the law in the broader sense of being scrupulous in keeping the law themselves and being willing to use a little strong-arm tactics to keep their fellow Jews in line. Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' chosen 12 disciples, had apparently been a zealot in this sense. But entering into the circle of Jesus' disciples meant for Simon entering into fellowship with dubious characters like Levi, the tax collector, whom Jesus had also called to discipleship. One wonders what zealous Jews like Simon thought of the women followers who accompanied Jesus and his male disciples on their journeys through Galilee, apparently without benefit as chaperones. Jesus' traveling entourage was a very mixed bag, and the superzealous would have not felt very comfortable even before they heard Jesus' command to love one's enemy and turn the other cheek. Well then, having defined Jesus negatively by excluding all the groups often used to pigeonhole him, how then are we to define Jesus by a via positiva? Speaking positively, what sort of Jew was Jesus? The very fact that our process of elimination has disposed of all the neat categories regularly trotted out underlines the basic problem, indeed the basic mistake, namely trying to fit Jesus the Jew into one of the clear categories supplied by Josephus, which may be artificial even in Josephus. What makes Jesus so hard to pin down is that he apparently combined so many different job descriptions within a short-lived 2-year ministry. Let me conclude then with a positive thumbnail sketch of this enigmatic Jew in all his complexity. Emerging from an obscure, ordinary life as a woodworker in the small hill town of Nazareth in southern Galilee, somewhere around the year 28 CE, Jesus accepts the eschatological preaching and baptism of John the Dunker. After staying for a while in the circle of John's disciples, Jesus moves out to create his own movement with his own disciples, some of whom apparently came from John's circle. You can read some tension there in John's disciples thinking Jesus has stolen John's thunder. John gave him the big start, and suddenly Jesus is hogging the stage. In addition to his disciples, indeed, Jesus takes from John both John's eschatological message and his baptism. Indeed, I think John's Gospel chapter 3 is right there. So pivotal was receiving baptism for Jesus himself. He continued to practice it in imitation of John. You could see why John's disciples would be a little bit upset. Nevertheless, certainly he did all this with some notable changes. While never totally giving up the sterner elements of John's warning of coming judgment, another aspect usually soft-pedaled today, Jesus does shift the emphasis to the good news of God coming as king to regather, heal, and save a scattered Israel. That is what the kingdom of God really means. God is coming in power to save his people finally, definitively. This message is made concrete in Jesus' activity as faith healer and exorcist, which also marks him off from John the Baptist, who never claimed to perform any miracles. Now, when one combines Jesus' reputation for performing a whole series of miracles with his reputation of being an itinerant prophet from northern Israel, proclaiming the regathering of the 12 tribes in the last days, the most likely conclusion from the background of Jewish scriptures and intertestamental literature is that Jesus presented himself to his fellow Israelites as the Elijah-like prophet of the end time. His message, his supposed miracles, his table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners, his stress on mercy and forgiveness for all Israel, not only pointed to the coming kingdom of God, but also in some sense made it already present in people's lives and experience. If by the finger of God I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has already come upon you, in the fact that these poor, tortured Israelites are set free from bondage right now. His choice of an inner circle of 12 disciples, his formation of them with distinctive observances, prayers, and teaching, and his sending them out on limited mission, implemented in an initial, symbolic way his eschatological vision for what Israel was to be. Yet, I must admit, other elements of Jesus' activity do not quite fit the model of the Elijah-like prophet of the end time. As might be expected of any sort of Jewish religious leader and teacher at the time, Jesus was concerned about the proper interpretation and practice of the Mosaic law. He presumed to teach this interpretation of Torah to his fellow Jews, despite his lack of any great formal education. Now, not surprisingly, this intensely, quintessentially Jewish reality of Jesus teaching halakha, Jesus teaching legal decisions and concrete legal practices to his fellow Jews, has been especially neglected by many Christian questers for the historical Jesus. Their traditional theological dichotomy of law and gospel, and their desire to align Jesus with Paul on the basis of this dichotomy, has blinded many of them to the quintessentially halakhic teaching and debates of Jesus. Now, this is not to say that grasping the contours of Jesus' halakhic teaching is easy. It is not. This halakhic teaching strikes one as a tension-filled combination. Emphasis on love, mercy, forgiveness on the one hand, and a call to a rigorous, radical, costly doing of God's will as revealed in the Torah on the other. By the way, let it be stated in no uncertain terms that it is nonsense to talk about Jesus the Jew abrogating or annulling the Torah. The Mosaic Torah is the given, the sacred canopy under which Jesus and every other devout Jew lives, seeks, and debates God's will. All the more strange, therefore, that at times this radical insistence on doing God's will completely, without compromise, seems in practice to lead to an abrogation not of the Mosaic Torah, but of some individual practices permitted or enjoined by the Torah, for example, divorce and oath-taking. Now, how this all fits together in Jesus' mind, if it does fit, is very hard to say. His uncompromising views on Torah, temple, and other key elements of Jewish practice and belief no doubt led to tension with many devout Jews, not just the Pharisees. With more fatal consequences, he also upset the ruling priestly and lay aristocracy in Jerusalem, who found his regular visits to the city and the temple increasingly disturbing. This town ain't big enough for both of us. Somewhere around the year 30 CE, Jesus made a decision to lead his disciples up to Jerusalem for Passover, apparently to engage there in a make-it-or-break-it confrontation with the people in power. This confrontation was made all the more volatile, not only by the large numbers of pilgrims streaming into the ancient Davidic capital, but also perhaps by a belief about Jesus himself that had spread among his followers, namely that Jesus was a descendant of King David. By arranging a formal entry into the city of David amid the acclamation of his followers, and then by acting out a symbolic cleansing or a symbolic destruction of the temple, Jesus may have been consciously playing the David card that he had carefully kept up his sleeve for most of his ministry as the Elijah-like prophet. If so, Caiaphas and Pilate quickly saw the danger of allowing this prophet, healer, exorcist, teacher of Torah and wisdom, and possibly Davidic claimant to stir up the Jewish pilgrims at Passover. As with John the Baptist, so with Jesus. A preemptive strike before things got out of control solved the problem, or so it seemed at the time. Jesus, the Elijah-like prophet and miracle worker from Galilee, winds up crucified in Jerusalem by the Roman prefect, on the strange charge of claiming to be king of the Jews. A final category added to the mix, a final category that makes a simple answer to the question, what sort of Jew was Jesus? Impossible. The basic problem is that Jesus combined in himself, within the short span of 2 years, too many different, not to say contradictory roles: prophet, healer, exorcist, Elijah-like forerunner of God's final coming, authoritative teacher of Torah, popular wisdom teacher, spinner of parables, and a descendant of David crucified by the Romans as king of the Jews. In what sense does any or all of this make Jesus unique from a historical as opposed to a faith perspective? In my opinion, the label unique is all too quickly and questionably applied to Jesus by scholars to describe this or that particular aspect of his teaching or activity. One cannot help but suspect here a crypto-theological claim masquerading as a historical claim. But I think we can apply the label of unique to the total configuration of interlocking parts making up the enigmatic whole that is Jesus. We can apply the label unique to this total complex pattern, this total gestalt of Jesus' person, message, activity, and fate within first century Palestinian Judaism. At this point, I can imagine Regis Philbin asking, is that your final answer? Well, no, Regis, but it will have to do for now. And my interim answer is not a case of theology pretending to be history. After all, from Moses, through Philo and Josephus, to Maimonides, Spinoza, Shabbatai Tzvi, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, and Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, history has known many Jewish leaders and/or geniuses, both religious and secular, who have defied neat categories and simplistic historical reductionism, even as they shook up both Jewish and Gentile history. Jesus, the Jewish genius, may be another case in point. In this sense, I can accept a modified form of the terse judgment of Edward, not Albert Schweitzer, Jesus the Jew, the man who fits no formula. This answer, which refuses a final Regis Philbin answer to the question, what sort of Jew was Jesus, will have to do for now, at least until Volume 4 appears. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Professor Meier has agreed to answer some questions. So if you please raise your hand, we'll see if we can recognize you. This gentleman?
Father, you mentioned that Jesus was probably celibate. Could you share with us a little bit about what evidence there is of that? And how unusual would it be for a nice Jewish boy like him in his 30s to be single in those days?
Right.
Would that be exceptional?
Yes. To repeat the question, I was asked to repeat the question for the sake of the whole audience, namely that I suggest in the talk, and I do elsewhere in my books, that Jesus was probably a celibate, and indeed that raises a very specific question. What are your grounds for thinking that, and how unusual would that be within first century Palestinian Judaism? Actually, there is a whole section in Volume 1 of A Marginal Jew where I go through all the various categories of Jesus growing up and his background. Was he literate? What was his family like? His status as a layman, not a priest. And in that whole series of questions, I treat the question of, was Jesus married? And the intriguing thing there is, watching the history of that for most of Christianity, and indeed, hilariously, even when you get atheists or agnostics treating the historical Jesus, it's sort of taken for granted, well, of course he was celibate. And indeed, it is only, shall we say, in American academic circles that perhaps since, is it by accident, since about the 1960s, that some people came forward saying, nonsense, any good Jew at the time would have been married, and you're arguing from silence, we're rather to presuppose that Jesus was married. And my answer is, first of all, in one sense you're perfectly correct, insofar as, intriguingly, the sources are totally silent about the question. And therefore, either side, it's not that one side is arguing from silence, the fact is, any position you take is an argument from silence. And of course, the question therefore is, what does silence betoken? If indeed, on one hand, George Bush gets up at a podium and is totally silent about my lecture this evening, that may betoken one thing, namely that he neither knows or cares about it. If indeed he gets up at the podium tonight and never mentions the war in Afghanistan or anthrax, that betokens something else. Silence means something or doesn't mean something in a particular context. And therefore the question is, what is the context in which we are to read this silence about Jesus' married status? Now, the one approach that would argue, well, of course he was married, is, well, the context, of course, is the Judaism at the time. And of course, as you just said, it would just be taken for granted, of course, that indeed a good religious man in particular, you read the later rabbinic literature, and is, of course, the first commandment given to the first man and woman in Genesis 1 is be fruitful and multiply. That is the first command. He who does not marry is as though he had committed murder of the whole human race. Certainly, but the question is, excuse me, I just quoted rabbinic literature from some centuries later. What is the context of Jesus' time? Was celibacy known at all in the Jewish tradition of the time? It was, of course, as it is today, as it is almost at any time, obviously a very unusual vocation, obviously, for all its beauty, not the choice of the majority, for whatever reasons. However, there is a certain, shall we say, minority tradition within Hebrew Scriptures, intertestamental Judaism in the time of Jesus, for a religiously grounded celibate state. The first prime example, of course, in the Hebrew Scriptures is Jeremiah, who did not find it exactly a joyous vocation. Apparently, it seems rather with the typical idea of prophetic symbolism, living, you just don't speak prophecy, you live it out. Isaiah runs around naked, symbolizing the coming captivity. Ezekiel lies on a side, mute, etc. And for Jeremiah, the sign of the end of business as usual, the crashing conclusion and shattering of the whole nation, the personal and corporate disaster of the nation was his own celibacy. Notice a rather negative prophetic sign at the time. By the time you get to the time of Jesus, intriguingly, we could go on greater length, both in the Greco-Roman world in general, and then within Palestinian Judaism in particular, there are some individuals, as I say, it never exactly caught out as mainstream, but some individuals apparently who, at least we can infer, I think, live celibate lives. There is, for instance, this rather strange prophet by the Jordan, Banos, that Josephus claims he ran off to and spent some time with. And this person lives apparently as a solitary in the Jordan Valley, reminding you very much of John the Baptist in the very stark ascetic life he leads. And indeed, of course, John the Baptist himself at least would strike, again, it's an argument for silence, but from everything we know about John the Baptist, would have been a very strange married life. Likewise, while maybe she would have liked wild honey, but the grasshopper bit would have been a bit much. Darling, what are we having for supper tonight? With the question of Qumran, it gets more difficult. Josephus himself, as so often Josephus, you read him carefully, it gets confusing and contradictory at times. But when Josephus gives his longest description of the Essenes, and it's interesting, they're the group he always lauds the most. He claims to be a Pharisee in his later autobiographical life. I think he's lying in his teeth. But certainly the group he lauds the most, the one he holds up as the grand philosophical school that's the ideal, rather the Essenes. And his lengthy portrait, he portrays them as celibate. And then interesting, right at the end, almost as an afterthought, he said, well, there is this other order that does marry. Interesting. And intriguingly, from, say, Pliny the Elder, we get a similar statement about this group by the Dead Sea that is almost miraculous because it neither marries nor gives birth, and yet it never increases or decreases at all. Rather remarkable thing. And then Philo doesn't speak certainly of Qumran, but the strange mystical group of Therapeutae in Egypt, if they're not a purely abstract construct, if he is representing some group. And most scholars today seem to think he's, however idealized, talking about some group. They too, interested both men and women in his presentation, are celibates. So notice the intriguing thing here is I find you have a pagan Roman historian, Pliny the Elder. You have Josephus, at least claiming to have lived in this area and experienced this directly in pre-70 Palestine. And you have Philo in Alexandria representing philosophical diaspora Jew, all three of them agreeing that somehow, some way, there was some celibate group in Judaism at the time. And so multiple attestation of sources, even if they don't have the details right, where there's smoke, there's fire. And then when you look at the distinction, say, in the documents found at Qumran, and Damascus document also known beforehand from the Cairo Geniza in the last century, there is this intriguing difference that with the Damascus document, which seems to be not for Qumran itself, but for the larger group of Essenes living in groups around Israel, in their special communities, there obviously is a question of marriage and families. And there's even, indeed, we get the problem of divorce mentioned in the Damascus document. Straight, and here again, argument from silence, but perhaps significant. By contrast, the Serach HaYahad, the rule of the community, the main, apparently, rule book for Qumran itself, has no such lengthy dispositions of a man and his family, divorce, and so forth. Now again, argument from silence, but contrasting that with the Damascus document, that the silence there may be indicative. So simply to state that indeed the background is not as simple as some people would suggest. It is much more first century Palestinian Judaism was a complicated, variegated reality. And there are these strands, however indeed minor, I'm sure they were very minor numerically, of some people apparently being celibate for religious reasons. Now, that's larger context. In the immediate context of the Gospels, again, silence. But silence within a given context. We hear nothing about Jesus' wife and children. We hear plenty about other women in his life, about his mother, named, his number of sisters, unnamed and uncounted, unlike the brothers, of course, get the male-centered nature of the Gospels. And of course, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, all these other women, named and unnamed, around him with whom he's interacting. When you stop to think of it, we have a fair amount of knowledge about Jesus' immediate family, including the women in the family and women followers. Within that intriguing, considering the androcentric nature of the Gospels, the amount of attention paid to the women around Jesus is quite intriguing. In that context, a total silence about his wife, either positive or negative relationships, is, shall we say, at least a bit strange. We hear about Isaiah's sons, we hear about Ezekiel's wife, we don't hear about Jeremiah's wife for a very particular reason. And then, granted all that, you have finally the very bizarre eunuch statement in Matthew 19, which comes out of the blue. Matthew tacks it on to the Markan dispute about divorce. And the story in Mark ends with Jesus giving the law that any man who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, any man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Mark doubles that for the woman because he's writing in a Roman context, but that's the end of the divorce story. Suddenly, out of the blue, you get Matthew tacking on. The disciples are amazed like this, and they say it's better for a man not to marry, if that's the case of things. And Jesus says not everybody can accept that saying, because there are some who are born eunuchs, there are some who are made eunuchs by other men, and there are those who eunuchize themselves, is the incredibly stark Greek, eunuchize themselves for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let him who can take it, take it. And of course, I mean, that saying comes out of the blue, goes nowhere, intriguingly is never echoed or represented in any tradition in the whole of the New Testament. In fact, none of the early fathers ever comment on it. You have to wait till a couple of centuries before the fathers of the church will even touch that statement. Such a hot potato is it. And indeed, precisely the unwillingness of either the rest of the New Testament or the early church even to go near that statement looks very much like this is one of those daring, mind-blowing, scandalizing statements that Jesus loved to make. It's easier for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle for any rich man to be saved. Here, eat my body, drink my blood. When you think of the violent images that Jesus so often uses, the Son of Man will come like a thief in the night and snatch you away. No wonder his sayings were remembered. I mean, so many of them, when you stop to think about it, they become like pebbles in a stream. The water has flown over them for 20th century, and we've allowed them to become smoothed down. But these are very sharp stones that he speaks. And therefore, to get back to your point there, the only likely context, if that comes from Jesus, is no doubt his very unusual, if not scandalous, status of a celibate running around not only with other men, but a group of women in his entourage. Probably, you can imagine, if he was called a glutton, a winebibber, friend of tax collectors and sinners, can you imagine what they were saying about him in this state? And what we may have here in the saying is precisely his mocking reply to that. Indeed, some people do eunuchize themselves for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So you excuse the lengthy process, but you notice argument from silence. The question is, what does the silence betoken, both in larger context and then in smaller context?